Throw her to the beasts. Maybe they'll succeed where we have failed." The words hit like ice water in her veins, and Lyra felt them settle into that familiar hollow space where hope used to live. Beta Marcus spoke with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather, his voice carrying across the evening courtyard where the entire pack had gathered to witness her latest humiliation. She kept her eyes fixed on the worn stones beneath her bare feet, counting the cracks she had memorized over 18 years of looking down, of making herself small, of perfecting the art of becoming nothing. The chains around her wrists were heavier than necessary. They always were. Iron meant for rogues and traitors, not for the grey shadow of a girl who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots without complaint. But Lyra understood the message in their weight. She had always been a problem to be solved, a burden to be eliminated, and tonight the pack had finally found their solution. "The beast pens," Luna Cassandra's voice dripped honey over steel as she stepped forward, her golden hair catching the torchlight like a crown. Everything about Cassandra was light where Lyra was shadow, beauty where Lyra was invisible, power where Lyra was nothing. "It's a merciful alternative to execution, really. The moon goddess will decide her fate." Merciful. Lyra almost smiled at the word. There was nothing merciful about what waited in those stone enclosures beyond the compound walls. She had heard the sounds that came from the beast pens after dark, the howls and roars and screams that made even the strongest warriors check their door locks twice. Moonhaven Pack kept creatures there that were too dangerous for normal punishment, too savage for training, too wild for anything but the most desperate measures. Dire wolves with eyes like molten gold and fangs the length of daggers. Shadow cats that moved like liquid darkness and struck without sound. Stone bears whose claws could shred metal and whose roars could shatter bone. The pack elders whispered that some of the creatures had been captured from the deepest parts of the Forbidden Forest, places where ancient magic still ran thick and deadly through the roots of trees older than memory. "Move!" Marcus growled, and rough hands shoved her forward. The crowd parted like water, creating a path toward the eastern gate, where the beast enclosures waited in the gathering darkness. Lyra stumbled but caught herself, muscle memory from years of abuse keeping her upright when her spirit wanted to crumble. She had learned long ago that falling only made the punishment worse. Pack members lined the walkway, their faces a blur of cruel satisfaction and morbid curiosity. Some of them had tormented her since childhood, finding sport in the girl who never fought back, who absorbed their hatred like a sponge and asked for nothing in return. Others simply watched with the detached interest of spectators at an execution, waiting to see how long she would last once the gates closed behind her. "Finally," someone whispered, "about time they dealt with the freak." "Should have done this years ago," another voice added. "Nothing but trouble, that one." Trouble. Lyra wanted to laugh at the accusation. What trouble had she ever caused? What rebellion had she ever staged? She had spent her entire life making herself smaller, quieter, more invisible, trying desperately to earn a place in a pack that had never wanted her. She cleaned their messes, served their meals, accepted their cruelty with silent endurance, and still they called her trouble. The beast pens rose before them like a stone nightmare, ancient walls that had contained horrors for generations. The air grew thick with the scent of predators and old blood, and even the guards escorting her began to move with nervous energy. Something roared in the distance, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, and Lyra felt her wolf stir for the first time in months. Her wolf! The pathetic, broken thing that barely qualified as a supernatural consciousness. Most pack members had strong, vibrant connections with their inner beasts, partnerships that made them faster, stronger, more than human. Lyra's wolf was a grey whisper of disappointment, weak and silent and ashamed, just like the girl it belonged to. The massive iron gates loomed ahead, their surfaces carved with warning runes that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the flickering torchlight. Beyond them lay darkness so complete it might have been solid, broken only by the occasional glint of predatory eyes watching from the shadows. The sounds coming from within made Lyra's blood freeze, low growls and hunting calls that spoke of creatures who had forgotten what it meant to show mercy. "Last chance to confess," Marcus said as the guards fumbled with the ancient locks. "Tell us what you really are, what dark magic you've been practicing, and maybe we'll make this quick." Dark magic. The accusation that had followed her since childhood, whispered whenever something went wrong, whenever the pack needed someone to blame. Crops failed, animals sickened, storms came out of season, and somehow it was always the fault of the girl who had never shown so much as a spark of supernatural ability beyond her broken wolf. Lyra had stopped protesting her innocence years ago. No one ever believed her anyway. The locks clicked open with sounds like breaking bones, and the gates began to swing inward with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. The darkness beyond was alive with movement, shapes that shifted and prowled and waited with the patience of born predators. The air that rolled out carried scents of wild things and ancient places, of creatures that had never learned to fear humans because humans had always been prey. "In you go!" Marcus shoved her forward, and Lyra stumbled across the threshold into hell itself. The stones beneath her feet were smooth and cold, worn by centuries of desperate pacing from things that had once been free. She could hear them moving in the darkness around her, circling, evaluating, deciding how best to tear her apart. The gate slammed shut behind her with the finality of a tomb ceiling, and Lyra was alone with monsters in the dark. She pressed her back against the stone wall and slid down to the ground, drawing her knees to her chest in the familiar position of someone who had learned to make herself as small as possible when the world decided to hurt her. This was how it would end, then, not with glory or redemption or any of the dreams she had never dared to voice, just darkness and teeth and the final confirmation that she had never been worth saving. The invisible girl would die invisible, and by morning there would be nothing left but bones and the pack's satisfied whispers that they had finally dealt with their problem. In the distance, something howled, long and mournful and filled with ancient rage. And deep in the hollow space where hope used to live, Lyra felt something stir in answer. The sacred grove had become a battlefield, ancient peace shattered by the clash of steel and the roar of creatures defending their awakened queen. Cassandra's forces had arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, 30 armed warriors moving with the coordination of soldiers who had trained together for months, their silver weapons gleaming with the kind of enchantments designed specifically to kill supernatural threats. They had expected to find a confused girl still struggling with newfound abilities, someone they could overwhelm through numbers and superior firepower before she fully understood what she had become. Instead, they found Lyra Silverbrook in her full power, standing in the centre of the sacred circle, with silver light dancing beneath her skin and every wild creature in the territory answering her call to arms. The dire wolf was the first to engage, its massive form launching itself at the lead warrior with fangs bared and golden eyes blazing with protective fury. The man's enchanted blade bit deep into the creature's shoulder, drawing blood that sparkled with its own inner light, but the dire wolf's jaws closed around his throat before he could complete a killing blow. Around the grove, the battle erupted into chaos as shadow cats materialized from darkness to strike at warriors who thought they understood stealth, and stone bears charged through defensive lines with the unstoppable force of living avalanches. Storm eagles dove from above with electricity crackling along their talons, while frost serpents coiled around legs and arms with ice that burned like fire. But Cassandra's forces had come prepared for supernatural opposition. Their weapons were blessed silver, their armour warded against mental compulsion, and their tactics spoke of careful study of beastmaster abilities throughout history. For every creature that struck, enchanted nets followed to entangle, and for every charge that broke their lines, disciplined formation, fighting restored order from chaos. Lyra stood in the centre of the grove and felt every wound inflicted on her loyal guardians like blows against her own flesh. The psychic connection that linked her to the wild creatures meant that their pain became her pain, their fear and rage flowing through her consciousness like a river of liquid fire that threatened to overwhelm her still new abilities. She had power beyond imagining, could feel the potential thrumming in her veins like captured lightning, but she had no experience wielding it as a weapon. 18 years of suppression had left her with instinct, but no training, heritage, but no practical knowledge of how to turn ancient birthright into modern victory. That was when Alpha King Thane arrived with his personal guard, drawn by the sounds of battle and the psychic shockwave of the mate bond under attack. He took in the scene with warrior's eyes, assessing threats and opportunities in the space between heartbeats, and made the choice that would define the rest of his reign. "Protect the grove," he commanded his guards, then shifted into his wolf form and launched himself into the battle beside creatures that had never bent their will to human authority. His massive black wolf was a force of nature among the combatants, jaws and claws working in deadly harmony with beings that recognized him as their queen's chosen mate. The arrival of reinforcements tipped the balance, but Cassandra herself had yet to enter the fight. She stood at the edge of the grove in her golden perfection, watching the battle with calculating eyes and hands that glowed with power that had nothing to do with her wolf heritage. When she finally stepped forward, the air around her shimmered with magical energy that spoke of abilities gained through means far darker than natural bloodline inheritance. "Enough," she said, and her voice carried compulsion that made warriors on both sides pause in their attacks. "This ends now, before more blood is spilled needlessly." Lyra felt the magical pressure of Cassandra's command pressing against her mind like a weight trying to crush her will, but her newly awakened abilities turned the attempted domination aside like water flowing around stone. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally claimed what had always been hers by right. "You're right," Lyra said, silver light beginning to intensify around her until the grove was painted in shades of starlight and shadow. "This does end now. No more poisoning, no more assassination attempts, no more pretending that you didn't orchestrate 18 years of systematic torture." Cassandra's perfect mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the desperate fear beneath her composed exterior. "You were a threat to the natural order," she said, her honey-sweet voice taking on edges of panic as Lyra's power continued to build. "The Beastmaster bloodlines were eliminated for good reason. Your kind brings chaos and destruction wherever they go." "My kind brings balance," Lyra corrected, and as she spoke, every creature in the grove turned their attention toward Cassandra with predatory focus. "We protect the compact between civilization and wilderness, ensure that neither dominates completely. You eliminated my parents because you feared what you couldn't control." The confrontation had drawn the attention of representatives from neighbouring territories who had come to witness what they thought would be a simple political wedding. Now they stood at the edges of the grove, watching in stunned silence as the future of supernatural politics rewrote itself in real time. Cassandra raised her hands, dark magic coiling around her fingers like living serpents, and Lyra felt the mate bond flare with sudden alarm as Thane's wolf form placed itself between them with protective snarls. But the silver blade that had belonged to her mother was still in Lyra's grasp, and when she raised it, the weapon blazed with light that turned night into day throughout the sacred grove. "You want to see what a Beastmaster can do when she stops hiding?" Lyra asked, and her voice carried harmonics that made the very earth tremble. "Let me show you." Power erupted from her in waves that rippled outward through the grove like visible force, silver light that carried the combined authority of every creature that had ever sworn loyalty to the ancient bloodlines. The light struck Cassandra's dark magic and shattered it like glass, then continued outward to wash over the assembled warriors and witnesses with energy that spoke directly to the supernatural consciousness buried in every shifter's soul. This was recognition magic, the kind of power that could not be counterfeited or commanded through politics. It reached into the deepest part of each person's awareness and showed them exactly what Lyra was, not a pretender or usurper, but the rightful heir to abilities that predated their current pack system by centuries. One by one, warriors who had been fighting against her dropped their weapons and sank to their knees in acknowledgement of power that their supernatural instincts recognized as legitimate authority. Even Cassandra's most loyal supporters found themselves unable to maintain aggression against someone their deeper nature insisted they should be protecting rather than attacking. Cassandra herself staggered backward as the recognition magic struck her, her perfect features contorting with rage and disbelief as she realized that her carefully constructed political reality was crumbling around her. "This is impossible," she snarled. "You're nobody. You're nothing. I made sure of that." "You made sure that I learned to survive," Lyra corrected, stepping closer as silver light continued to dance around her transformed form. "You made sure that when I finally came into my power, I would understand exactly how precious freedom really is. You made me stronger by trying to break me." The mate bond that connected her to Thane suddenly flared with golden radiance as he shifted back to human form and moved to stand beside her, his presence amplifying her already overwhelming supernatural authority. When they stood together, the recognition magic intensified until even the stones of the grove rang with harmonic resonance. "I choose her," Thane declared, his voice carrying across the grove to reach every witness, every warrior, every representative who would carry word of this moment back to their territories. "I choose the mate bond over political convenience, truth over comfortable lies, and love over the fear that keeps us small." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical force, and Lyra felt the exact moment when their future shifted from impossible dream to inevitable reality. The neighbouring pack representatives, who had come expecting to witness a wedding, found themselves witnessing something far more significant, the public claiming of a bond that would reshape the supernatural world. Cassandra made one final desperate attempt to salvage her position, dark magic coiling around her form as she prepared to strike directly at Lyra with power that felt like corruption given form. But the dire wolf was faster, launching itself between them with protective fury that spoke of bonds deeper than magic or politics. The creature took Cassandra's killing blow across its ribs, silver blood spraying across the sacred stones, but its sacrifice gave Lyra the opening she needed. Power flowed through her like a river of liquid starlight, and when she struck back, it was with the combined strength of every wild thing that had ever lived free. Cassandra's scream cut through the grove as the blast of pure supernatural force lifted her off her feet and sent her crashing into the standing stones with enough impact to crack ancient granite. When she tried to rise, she found herself surrounded by creatures whose loyalty had been earned rather than commanded, whose protection was given freely rather than extracted through fear. "It's over," Lyra said, kneeling beside the injured dire wolf and feeling its life force stabilize under the touch of her healing power. "The suppression, the lies, the systematic destruction of everything my parents built, all of it ends here." Around the grove, representatives from a dozen territories knelt in acknowledgement of the new reality that had just been born. The Beastmaster bloodline was awake and claiming its rightful place in the supernatural hierarchy, backed by an Alpha King who had chosen love over political expediency and supported by creatures whose loyalty could reshape the balance of power across the entire continent. As dawn broke over the sacred grove, painting the stones in shades of gold and silver, Lyra Silverbrook stood with her mate's hand in hers and felt the weight of destiny finally settling into place. She was no longer the invisible girl who had learned to make herself small. She was the bridge between worlds, the heir to ancient power, and the queen who would ensure that the compact between civilization and wilderness endured for generations yet to come. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. 3 months had transformed the Moonhaven Pack compound from a place of rigid hierarchy and cruel tradition into something that resembled the ancient descriptions of Beastmaster sanctuaries. The throne room where Lyra now held court was no longer a monument to dominance, but a space where the compact between civilization and wilderness was honoured in every carved detail and living arrangement. The dire wolf lay at her feet as she reviewed territorial agreements, its massive head resting on paws that could crush stone, while its golden eyes tracked every movement of the delegates who came seeking audience with the newly acknowledged Beast Queen. The shadow cat perched on the arm of her throne with violet eyes that missed nothing, while storm eagles roosted in the high rafters with electricity crackling softly along their feathers. It was a sight that would have been impossible to imagine when she had been the invisible servant girl who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. Now, representatives from territories as far as the eastern coastlands travelled for weeks to seek her counsel on disputes that their own leaders could not resolve, understanding that someone who commanded the loyalty of every wild creature possessed wisdom that transcended ordinary political manoeuvring. The border dispute between Ironwood and Thornfield has been escalating for months, Elder Matthias reported, his weathered hands holding documents that detailed cattle raids and territorial violations. Both packs claim ancestral rights to the valley where the silver mines operate, and neither will yield to traditional arbitration. Lyra listened with the patience she had learned during her years of invisibility, but now that patience served a different purpose. Instead of hiding from attention, she used stillness to gather information from sources that spoke in languages beyond human words. Through her connection to the wild network that spanned the continent, she could feel the truth that lay beneath political posturing and territorial greed. The wolves that den in that valley have been there for 7 generations, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had stopped questioning her right to speak. They remember when the first pack claimed those lands, and they remember why the second pack was granted hunting rights but not permanent settlement. The silver belongs to neither group. It belongs to the mountain spirits who have been mining it since before humans learned to work metal. The revelation hit the gathered council with the weight of truth that could not be argued or negotiated away. Through her abilities, Lyra had access to historical records that existed in the memories of creatures whose lifespans measured centuries rather than decades. What seemed like an intractable dispute became simple justice when viewed through the lens of supernatural awareness. "What do you recommend, Your Majesty?" Elder Matthias asked, using the title that had taken months for the pack to fully accept, but now came as naturally as breathing. "Both packs will withdraw their claims and establish a joint council to manage mining operations under the supervision of the mountain spirits," Lyra replied. "Profits will be shared equally, and neither group will maintain permanent settlements in the Sacred Valley. The wolves will serve as neutral arbitrators for any future disputes." It was the kind of solution that would have been impossible under the old system of pack politics, where strength determined right and territory was claimed through violence rather than negotiated through wisdom. But the Beast Queen's word carried authority that transcended ordinary supernatural hierarchies, backed by loyalty that could not be bought or coerced. Thane entered the throne room as the delegates departed, his presence immediately causing the creatures around Lyra to shift their attention toward him with recognition that went deeper than simple acceptance. The mate bond had evolved over the months into something that amplified both their abilities, creating a partnership that made them more effective together than either could have been alone. "How did the negotiation with the Eastern Territories conclude?" Lyra asked, rising from the throne to meet him in the centre of the room where they could speak without the formality that surrounded official court proceedings. "Better than we dared hope," Thane replied, and there was satisfaction in his voice that spoke of diplomatic victories hard won through strength and wisdom rather than fear and appeasement. When Ambassador Roderick realized that attacking our territory would mean facing every wild creature from the mountains to the sea, his enthusiasm for conquest diminished considerably. The transformation of their pack's political position had been as dramatic as Lyra's personal awakening. Where once they had been vulnerable to larger territories and dependent on marriage alliances for protection, they now commanded respect through supernatural authority that made traditional warfare seem quaint and ineffective. The formal treaty? Lyra asked, though through their bond she could already sense his satisfaction with the terms. Non-aggression pacts with all neighbouring territories, trade agreements that favour our position, and most importantly, recognition of your status as sovereign beast queen with authority that transcends pack boundaries, Thane said, moving closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. We're no longer just another pack struggling for survival. We're the centre of a new supernatural order. Lyra leaned into his embrace, feeling the golden warmth of the mate bond flare to comfortable brightness as their skin touched. The months since their public claiming had deepened their connection until it felt less like two separate people bound together and more like two halves of a single consciousness that happened to inhabit different bodies. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, she admitted, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability in his arms. 3 months ago I was nobody. Now delegations travel from across the continent to ask my opinion on territorial disputes I never would have imagined I had the right to comment on. 3 months ago you were already everything you are now, Thane corrected, his voice gentle but firm. The only thing that changed was that you stopped letting other people convince you to be smaller than what the moon goddess made you. The truth of his words settled into her consciousness like a key turning in a lock. Her worth had never been in question, except by those who had their own reasons for keeping her diminished. The power, the authority, the loyalty of creatures and respect of leaders, all of it had been waiting for her to claim rather than waiting to be earned through suffering or sacrifice. The pregnancy? Thane asked, and she felt his attention focus on the subtle changes in her scent that had become apparent over the past week. Lyra smiled and placed his hand against her still flat stomach, where new life was already beginning to grow with the combined heritage of Beastmaster and Alpha King bloodlines. Confirmed this morning by Dr. Hendricks, the heir will carry both our gifts, both our responsibilities. The joy that flooded through their bond was pure and overwhelming, carrying with it visions of a future where their child would never have to hide their nature or pretend to be less than what they were. A future where the compact between civilization and wilderness would be preserved and strengthened by new generations who understood that true leadership meant protecting what mattered rather than controlling what could be dominated. When? Thane asked, his voice rough with emotion that made her heart flutter with recognition of how much this meant to both of them. 7 months, Lyra replied, just enough time to finish establishing the new territorial agreements and train the next generation of beastmasters who are already beginning to awaken throughout the continent. The revelation that she was not the only surviving heir had been one of the most significant discoveries of the past months. Her awakening had triggered responses in distant bloodlines that had been suppressed for generations, calling them home to sanctuaries where ancient abilities could be nurtured rather than feared. They stood together in the throne room, where she had once cleaned floors as an invisible servant, surrounded by loyal creatures and the evidence of a world transformed through courage rather than conquest. The girl who had believed she was worthless had become the queen who understood that worth was not something to be earned, but something to be claimed and defended. And in 7 months that legacy would continue through a child who would never know what it meant to hide their light under someone else's shadows. The sacred grove had been transformed for their private mating ceremony, ancient stones draped with silver silk that caught moonlight and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own inner fire. This was not the political spectacle that Cassandra's wedding would have been, with hundreds of witnesses and formal protocols governing every word and gesture. This was something far more profound, a claiming that reached back to the oldest traditions when beastmasters and their chosen mates pledged themselves not just to each other, but to the eternal compact between human and wild. Only the creatures were present to witness their vows, arranged in reverent circles around the ceremonial space where Lyra's parents had once stood and claimed each other with words that had echoed through generations. The dire wolf sat at attention with silver fur gleaming in the moonlight, while storm eagles perched in the ancient trees with electricity crackling softly along their wings in approval. Lyra wore a gown woven from spider silk and starlight, or at least that was how it appeared in the supernatural radiance that surrounded everything in the grove. Her silver-white hair fell in waves around shoulders that no longer carried the weight of invisibility and shame, and when she moved, the very air seemed to shimmer with recognition of power finally claimed and properly honoured. Thane stood waiting for her in the centre of the stone circle, dressed not in the formal regalia of an alpha king, but in simple clothing that spoke of a man who had learned the difference between authority that was commanded and leadership that was earned. When their eyes met across the sacred space, the mate bond flared with golden light that made even the ancient stones sing with harmonic resonance. Before these witnesses who know the true nature of loyalty, Lyra began, her voice carrying across the grove with the authority of someone who had finally learned to trust her own worth. I claim you as mine, Thane Moonhaven, Alpha King and protector of the compact between worlds. Before the spirits of this sacred place, Thane replied, I claim you as mine, Lyra Silverbrook, Beast Queen and bridge between civilization and wilderness, heir to bloodlines older than memory and keeper of promises that transcend ordinary understanding of love and partnership. The words were not just vows, but binding magic, creating connections that reached deeper than conscious thought to touch the supernatural consciousness that governed their world. When they joined hands in the centre of the circle, silver and gold light spiralled around them with such intensity that the grove itself seemed to exist in a space between mortal reality and the realm where ancient promises became living law. I was told I was nothing, Lyra said, her voice soft but carrying absolute certainty. I believed I was broken, worthless, a burden that existed only through the charity of those who saw me as less than complete. But you saw something different, didn't you? Thane's smile was tender enough to break hearts and strong enough to rebuild them. I saw exactly what you were from the moment I found you with those beasts in the punishment pens. I saw someone who commanded loyalty not through fear, but through recognition. Someone who was royal not because of politics, but because of something fundamental in their nature that called to everything wild and free. Even when you knew it would cost you everything? Lyra asked, though through their bond she already knew the answer. Especially then, Thane replied, lifting her hands to his lips and pressing kisses to her palms where silver light danced beneath her skin. A crown means nothing if you have to sacrifice your soul to wear it. A kingdom built on lies and fear is not worth ruling, but a partnership with someone who makes you better than you ever thought you could be, that's worth every political alliance and territorial advantage in existence. The grove erupted in sounds of approval as creatures lifted their voices in harmonies that spoke of bonds recognised and blessings given. This was how matings were supposed to be witnessed, not by crowds of political observers, but by the wild things whose loyalty could not be bought or commanded, whose approval had to be earned through truth and courage and the willingness to protect what mattered. When they kissed, the mate bond completed itself with such intensity that every creature in the grove felt the golden wave of connection that bound not just two people, but two bloodlines, two forms of power that would strengthen and support each other for generations to come. The light that surrounded them was visible for miles, announcing to any who cared to witness that the ancient compact had been renewed and would continue through their children and their children's children. Later, as dawn painted the grove in shades of rose and gold, they sat together on the stones where her parents had once planned the future that their daughter would inherit. Lyra's head rested against Thane's shoulder, her hand on the subtle curve of her stomach, where new life grew with each passing day. "Do you ever wonder what they would think?" she asked, meaning the parents whose sacrifice had made this moment possible. "If they would be proud of what we've built?" "I think," Thane said, his arm tightening around her with protective tenderness, "they would be amazed by how their daughter transformed 18 years of systematic cruelty into wisdom and strength. They died believing that someday you would claim what was yours by right. They could never have imagined that you would surpass everything they dreamed of and create something even more powerful." Lyra closed her eyes and felt the truth of his words settle into her consciousness like pieces of a puzzle finally completing themselves. She had spent so long focused on what had been stolen from her that she had nearly missed what had been given instead. The ability to understand cruelty from the inside, to recognize worth that existed independent of external validation, to protect others from the invisible wounds that left the deepest scars. "I love you," she said, the words carrying weight that transformed them from simple declaration into binding promise. Not just because of the mate bond or the political alliance or any of the practical reasons that brought us together. "I love you because you saw me when I was invisible and chose to stand beside me when I finally learned to take up space." "And I love you," Thane replied, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head where silver hair caught the morning light, "because you reminded me that true strength is not about domination or control, but about creating space for others to flourish. When I stopped believing I had to choose between duty and desire, I discovered that the right choice was always to choose love." The sun rose over the sacred grove, painting ancient stones in shades of promise and possibility. In 7 months, their child would be born into a world where beastmasters were honoured rather than hunted, where the compact between civilization and wilderness was protected by those who understood that some bonds transcended politics and fear. And in the growing light of a new day, Lyra Silverbrook sat with her mate's arms around her and finally understood the lesson that had taken 18 years to learn. When she stopped believing she was worthless, she discovered she was priceless. Did you predict that the beasts would recognize her royal blood from the beginning? Let me know in the comments what moment made you realize she was always meant to be queen. The darkness was absolute, pressing against Lyra's skin like a living thing with weight and texture and malevolent intent. She had pressed herself so deeply into the corner where 2 stone walls met that the rough surface bit into her spine through her thin servant's dress, but the pain was familiar, almost comforting. Pain meant she was still alive, still breathing, still clinging to existence for a few more precious moments before the inevitable end. The creatures moved through the shadows with sounds that made her blood freeze, the scrape of claws against stone, the whisper of fur brushing against walls, the soft pad of massive paws that could crush her skull with a single step. They were hunting her, she knew, circling like the predators they were, taking their time because trapped prey had nowhere to run and terror always made the meat taste sweeter. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to practice the invisibility that had kept her alive for 18 years. Become nothing, become grey, become so small and unremarkable that even death might overlook her for someone more interesting. She had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight, of moving through the pack compound like a shadow that cast no reflection, noticed by no one and mourned by fewer. But invisibility required an audience to ignore you, and these creatures operated on instincts far older and more honest than human cruelty. They could smell her fear, hear her hammering heartbeat, sense the warm rush of blood through veins that had no idea how to stop being alive, even when life had become a burden too heavy to carry. Something approached through the darkness, and Lyra felt rather than saw its presence, massive, ancient, carrying the scent of wild forests and moonlit hunts and freedom that had never been caged. Her broken wolf stirred in response, lifting its head for the first time in months like a flower turning towards sunlight, and Lyra gasped at the sensation of her other half actually responding to something in the world around them. The creature stepped into the faint moonlight that filtered through the iron grates high above, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. It was a dire wolf, but not like any she had ever seen. This one stood nearly as tall as a horse, its fur silver-white with markings that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Its eyes were amber like molten gold, ancient and knowing, and filled with an intelligence that made her feel small in ways that had nothing to do with fear. The dire wolf approached with careful steps, each paw placed with deliberate precision on the stone floor. It should have been stalking, should have been preparing to strike, should have been showing the aggressive dominance that all predators displayed when cornering helpless prey. Instead, it moved like something approaching a sacred altar, reverent and cautious and confused by its own behaviour. When it reached her, the massive creature did something that made Lyra's mind struggle to process what she was witnessing. It lowered its great head and sniffed deeply, drawing in her scent with the concentration of someone reading a book written in a language they had almost forgotten. Then it stepped back with a sound that could only be described as a whimper of recognition, its golden eyes wide with something that looked almost like wonder. The dire wolf sank to its belly on the cold stone and rested its massive head on its paws, never taking its eyes from her face. The position was one of submission, of acknowledgement, of a loyalty so profound it bordered on worship, and as if that impossible display had been some kind of signal, other shapes began emerging from the shadows around them. A shadow cat materialized from darkness so complete it might have been born there, its violet eyes glowing like amethysts in the moonlight. Its fur was black as midnight and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the illusion that pieces of reality were missing wherever it moved. Shadow cats were known for their cruelty, their love of playing with prey before delivering the killing blow, but this one approached with the same reverent care as the dire wolf and settled beside it in a pose of perfect submission. A stone bear lumbered forward, its massive frame easily twice the size of any natural bear, its fur appearing to be carved from granite and crystal. Its claws caught the moonlight and threw it back in sharp fragments that painted rainbow patterns on the stone walls. Stone bears were earth elementals, creatures of terrible strength and implacable rage, yet this one sat back on its haunches like a trained pet and watched her with eyes that held depths of understanding she had never seen in any beast. One by one they came, emerging from the darkness like figures from a fever dream. Storm eagles with wingspans wider than a man could reach and feathers that sparked with actual electricity. Frost serpents whose scales gleamed like ice and whose breath turned the air around them to visible mist. Moon panthers with silver spots that seemed to shift and dance across their midnight coats. Fire salamanders whose skin glowed with inner heat and left smoking paw prints on the ancient stones. Every single creature that had been placed in these pens to serve as instruments of execution was now arranged in a perfect circle around her, each one resting in poses of absolute submission. They watched her with eyes that held recognition, reverence, and something that looked disturbingly like relief, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for this moment and had finally found what they were searching for. Lyra stared at the impossible scene and felt something deep in her chest begin to warm. It started as barely more than a flutter, a sensation like butterfly wings against her ribs, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. The warmth spread outward through her body, reaching places that had been cold and numb for so long she had forgotten they existed, and with it came a presence she had never felt before. It was not her broken wolf. That pathetic creature still cowered in the back of her mind, as confused and frightened as Lyra herself. This was something else, something ancient and powerful and utterly alien to everything she thought she knew about herself. It stirred in the deepest parts of her consciousness, like something waking from a very long sleep, and when it touched her awareness, her entire world shifted. She could feel them, not just see them or hear them, but actually feel every creature in the circle as if they were extensions of her own body. Their heartbeats became her heartbeat. Their breathing matched her own. Their loyalty flowed through her veins like liquid fire. They were not just watching her or even acknowledging her. They were recognizing her as something she had never imagined she could be. The dire wolf lifted its massive head and spoke directly into her mind, its voice like distant thunder and ancient songs and the whisper of wind through sacred groves. "Finally," it said, and the word carried weight that made her bones ache with recognition. "Finally, you have come home." Around the circle, every creature echoed the sentiment in their own mental voices, creating a chorus of welcome that made Lyra feel dizzy with emotions she had no names for. The shadow cat purred like a landslide given voice. The stone bear rumbled approval that she felt in her chest. The storm eagles cried triumph that rang through her soul like bells. Dawn was approaching, painting the eastern sky with threads of pale gold that filtered down through the grates above. In that growing light, Lyra sat in the centre of a circle of the most dangerous predators in the known world, every single one of them lying at her feet like loyal pets waiting for their beloved master to acknowledge their devotion. And deep in that warm, hollow space where hope used to live, her true wolf consciousness whispered words that changed everything. "Finally, they know what we are." The morning sun painted the beast pens in shades of gold and amber, transforming the stone walls from instruments of terror into something almost beautiful. Almost. The light could not quite erase the memories of what these enclosures were meant for, could not soften the reality of bones and blood and screams that had soaked into the ancient stones over generations of executions. But it illuminated something that defied every law of nature and pack politics that Alpha King Thane had ever learned. The girl they had thrown to the beasts as a final solution to their problem sat in perfect stillness at the centre of a circle of deadly predators, every single creature arranged around her in poses of absolute submission. Thane stood frozen at the iron gates, his hand still gripping the keyring that had fallen silent when the locks clicked open. Behind him, his personal guard, Captain Reed, made a sound that might have been a prayer or a curse, and Beta Marcus dropped to his knees on the stone pathway as if his legs had simply forgotten how to function. "Impossible," someone whispered, but Thane could not tell who had spoken. His entire world had narrowed to the scene before him, to the girl who should have been nothing but scattered bones and torn fabric by now, surrounded instead by creatures that had never shown mercy to anyone. The dire wolf was the largest he had ever seen, its silver coat marked with patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. It lay with its massive head resting on paws that could have crushed a man's skull, watching the girl with devotion that bordered on worship. Beside it, a shadow cat that had killed 3 warriors last spring purred like distant thunder, its violet eyes never leaving her face. A stone bear that had once torn apart an entire raiding party sat back on its haunches like a trained pet, while storm eagles perched along the walls with their electric feathers crackling softly in the still air. Every single creature that the pack had feared, that they had used as instruments of final punishment, was now arranged in perfect submission around a girl they had dismissed as worthless. Thane's wolf consciousness slammed against his mental barriers with sudden overwhelming force. The beast inside him had been restless for weeks, pacing and whining and searching for something it could not name. Now it threw itself against his control with desperate hunger, howling words that made no sense and yet carried the weight of absolute truth. Mate. Mine. Ours. Claim her. Now. The thoughts hit him like physical blows, and Thane staggered back a step before catching himself. His wolf had never reacted to anyone like this, had never shown interest in any of the eligible females who had been paraded before him over the years. It had accepted the arranged marriage to Luna Cassandra with the same indifference it showed to most political necessities. But now it was going insane with recognition, with a certainty that defied everything Thane thought he knew about mate bonds and political realities. This girl was nobody. She was less than nobody. She was the servant who emptied his chamber pot and scrubbed his floors, the shadow who had never spoken more than 3 words in his presence, the problem the pack had finally decided to eliminate, and his wolf was claiming she belonged to him. "My king!" Captain Reed's voice was carefully controlled, but Thane could hear the tremor beneath the professional calm. "What are your orders?" Orders, as if there were protocols for discovering that the girl they had condemned to death was somehow commanding the loyalty of creatures that answered to no one. As if the sight of her sitting in perfect stillness while deadly predators arranged themselves around her like devoted pets was something that could be handled with standard military procedure. Thane stepped through the gates and into the enclosure, moving slowly so as not to startle the creatures or the girl who somehow held their allegiance. The dire wolf's ears twitched at his approach, and those golden eyes shifted to track his movement with keen intelligence, but it made no move to attack or defend. It simply watched, as if evaluating whether he was worthy of approaching its chosen one. "Lyra," he called softly, and she looked up at him with eyes that were wider and more luminous than he remembered. Had they always held that silver-grey depth, or was he seeing something new in the morning light? "Are you hurt?" She blinked at him as if the question made no sense, as if the concept of injury had never occurred to her. When she spoke, her voice was the same whisper he remembered, but something in her tone had changed. There was a steadiness there that had not existed before, a quiet certainty that made his wolf pace with increased agitation. "No," she said simply. "They didn't hurt me. They protected me." Protected. Thane looked around the circle of predators and tried to process that word. These creatures did not protect. They killed. They devoured. They served as final punishment for crimes so heinous that quick execution would have been mercy. Yet every single one of them watched Lyra with the devotion of guardians who had found their most precious charge. "How?" The word came out rougher than he intended, and Lyra flinched slightly at his tone. Thane forced his voice to gentleness, though his wolf continued to pace and whine and demand actions he did not understand. "How is this possible?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to pain her, and she looked down at her hands where they rested in her lap. I don't understand what happened. They were going to kill me, and then they just stopped. They recognized something, but I don't know what." Behind him, Thane could hear more pack members arriving, their voices rising in shocked whispers as they witnessed the impossible scene. Luna Cassandra's distinctive laugh cut through the murmur, sharp and brittle as breaking glass. "How fascinating," Cassandra said, her words carrying the false sweetness that always preceded her cruelest observations. "It seems our little servant has been hiding talents. What kind of dark magic have you been practicing, dear? What bargains have you made to command such creatures?" Dark magic. The accusation that had followed Lyra since childhood, the convenient explanation for every misfortune that befell the pack. Thane had never paid much attention to the whispers, had dismissed them as the petty cruelty that always targeted the powerless. But now, looking at the circle of predators that treated her like their queen, he found himself wondering what other explanations might exist. "Answer her!" Beta Marcus demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been denied. "What are you?" Lyra's head snapped up at the harsh tone, and something flashed in her eyes that made Thane's breath catch. For just a moment she looked less like the invisible servant girl and more like something dangerous wearing her form. Then the expression faded, leaving only confusion and fear in its wake. "I don't know," she repeated, But this time the words carried less certainty. "I don't know what I am." The dire wolf lifted its massive head and made a sound that was part whine, part song, and entirely inhuman. The other creatures stirred in response, a ripple of movement that spoke of shared communication beyond human understanding. They were talking to each other, Thane realised, exchanging information in ways that had nothing to do with sound or scent. And somehow Lyra was part of that conversation. Her eyes grew distant, unfocused, as if she were listening to voices only she could hear. When she looked at him again, there was something different in her expression, something that made his wolf throw itself against his mental barriers with renewed desperation. "They say," she began, then stopped and shook her head. "This is impossible. I must be losing my mind." "Tell me," Thane commanded, and the authority in his voice surprised even him. "What do they say?" Lyra was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, so softly, he had to strain to hear her. "They say they've been waiting. They say they knew I would come eventually. They say—" She looked up at him with eyes that held depths he had never noticed before. "They say I'm home." Home! The word hit Thane like a physical blow, and his wolf responded with a howl of recognition that nearly brought him to his knees. Everything clicked into place with the terrible clarity of truth that could not be denied or explained away. The mate bond, the impossible scene before him, the way his beast had been restless and searching for weeks. The girl they had dismissed as nothing was everything his wolf had been looking for, and somehow these ancient predators had recognized what his human mind had been too blind to see. "My king," Captain Reed stepped forward cautiously. "Perhaps we should return to the compound. There will be questions about this development." Questions? Thane almost laughed at the understatement. There would be investigations and accusations and political complications that could destroy everything he had worked to build. A servant girl commanding the loyalty of creatures that answered to no one was problematic enough. A servant girl who might be his mate was a catastrophe that could shatter pack alliances and upset the careful balance of power he had spent years constructing. But as he looked at Lyra sitting in her circle of impossible guardians, as his wolf continued to pace and claim and demand recognition of what they both knew to be true, Thane realised that questions and complications and political disasters were the least of his concerns. He was looking at his mate, and everything else, everything he thought he knew about her and about himself and about the way their world was supposed to work, was about to change forever. The Alpha King's private study was a world Lyra had never imagined she would enter. Rich mahogany shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that spoke of centuries of accumulated knowledge and power. The massive desk dominated the centre of the room like a throne, its surface polished to mirror brightness and decorated with artefacts that probably cost more than most pack members earned in a lifetime. Lyra stood just inside the doorway, every instinct screaming at her to make herself smaller, to find a corner where she could disappear until this nightmare ended. The opulence surrounding her was a constant reminder that she did not belong here, that girls who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots were not meant to breathe the same air as Alpha Kings. But Alpha King Thane had commanded her presence, and when an Alpha King spoke, even invisible servant girls had no choice but to obey. She kept her eyes fixed on her bare feet against the imported carpet, counting threads and trying to become nothing, while he paced around her like a predator circling prey. "Look at me," he commanded, and the authority in his voice made her wolf stir with recognition that felt both foreign and familiar. When she reluctantly raised her eyes, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her skin burn. "Tell me about your parents." The question hit like a physical blow, and Lyra felt herself flinch. Her parents were the wound that had never healed, the mystery that had defined her entire existence in ways she barely understood. "I don't remember them," she whispered, the standard response she had given to this question for 18 years. "They died when I was very young." "How young?" Thane moved closer, and she caught his scent on the air between them. Pine and mountain storms, and something else. Something wild and clean that made her broken wolf lift its head with interest. "Where did they die? How?" "I don't know." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw his eyes narrow at her tone. Fear immediately flooded through her, the familiar terror of stepping out of line, of showing even a hint of defiance that might provoke punishment. "I'm sorry, my king. I didn't mean to sound... I just don't remember anything before coming to the pack." Thane stopped his pacing and stood directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes, close enough that his presence seemed to fill her entire field of vision. "You have no memories of your life before Moonhaven? None at all?" The gentleness in his voice was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. Lyra was used to cruelty, understood the rules that governed pain and punishment. But kindness from an Alpha King was territory so foreign she had no map to navigate it. "Sometimes I have dreams," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "But they don't make sense, just fragments. A woman singing, silver light, the sound of wolves howling, but different wolves, sad wolves." Something flickered in Thane's expression, and he leaned forward slightly. "Different how?" "I don't know how to explain it." Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. "In the dreams the howling sounds like mourning, like they're crying for something they lost." Thane was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Lyra became aware of how alone they were. No guards, no witnesses, no pack protocols governing what happened when Alpha Kings questioned servant girls in private. The impropriety of the situation should have terrified her, but instead she felt something else entirely, something that made her skin tingle and her breath catch and her broken wolf pace with restless energy. "When did the dreams start?" he asked, and his voice was softer now, almost intimate. "They've always been there," she said, "but lately they've been getting stronger, more vivid. Sometimes I wake up and I can almost remember faces, but then they fade before I can hold on to them." "Lately," Thane repeated, and there was something significant in the way he spoke the word. "How lately?" Lyra thought about it, trying to pinpoint when the dreams had intensified. "A few weeks ago, maybe, right around the time you—" She stopped, realizing what she had been about to say. "Right around the time I what?" His eyes were fixed on her face with laser focus, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Right around the time you came back from the Northern Territories," she finished quietly. "But that's just coincidence. It has to be." Thane stepped closer, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with electricity. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't move, his fingers brushed against her cheek with a gentleness that made her entire world tilt sideways. The moment their skin touched, golden light exploded behind her eyelids, and warmth flooded through her body like liquid fire. She gasped and jerked backward, but Thane caught her wrist before she could fully retreat. The contact sent shockwaves up her arm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition that made no sense. "What was that?" she whispered, staring at their joined hands. Where his skin touched hers, she could feel a pulse that seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat, a connection that felt ancient and profound and utterly impossible. Thane's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotions she couldn't identify. "That," he said, "is the mate bond." The words hit her like ice water, and Lyra yanked her hand free as if he had burned her. "That's impossible," she said, backing away until her shoulders hit the bookshelf behind her. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing. Alpha Kings don't have mate bonds with servant girls." "The Moon Goddess doesn't care about pack politics," Thane said, but there was pain in his voice that belied the confidence of his words. "She chooses what she chooses, and we don't get to argue with her decisions." "But you're engaged," Lyra protested, desperation making her voice shake. You're supposed to marry Luna Cassandra next month. The whole pack is planning for the ceremony. You can't just... This can't be real. Thane ran his hands through his hair, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked less like an unshakable alpha king and more like a man facing an impossible situation. "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know exactly how complicated this is. The marriage alliance with Cassandra's pack is crucial for our survival. Without it, we'll be vulnerable to attacks from the Eastern Territories. People will die if that alliance falls apart." "Then ignore this," Lyra said, wrapping her arms around herself again. "Pretend it never happened. I won't tell anyone. I'll disappear if you want. I'll leave the pack and you'll never have to see me again." "You think I haven't considered that?" Thane's voice was sharp enough to cut. "You think the idea of walking away from this, from you, hasn't crossed my mind every moment since I found you with those beasts this morning?" The pain in his tone made something crack inside her chest. "Then why don't you? Why are we even having this conversation?" Thane looked at her with eyes that held depths of longing and frustration, and something that might have been desperation. "Because every time I try to convince myself to do the right thing, to choose duty over desire, my wolf threatens to tear me apart from the inside. Because the mate bond doesn't just disappear because it's inconvenient. Because the moon goddess has a sense of humour that borders on cruelty, and she's decided that the one person in this world who could complete my soul is someone I can never actually claim." The raw honesty in his words stole her breath. Lyra stared at him and saw past the Alpha King mask to the man beneath, saw the conflict that was tearing him in two just as surely as it was destroying her. The mate bond pulsed between them like a living thing, drawing them together even as duty and logic and pack politics pulled them apart. "What happens now?" she whispered. Thane was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the effort it took to maintain that composure. "Now I do what I should have done the moment I realized what you are," he said. "I research your bloodline, I find out who you really are and why those creatures recognized you, and I try to figure out how to protect you from the people who will want to destroy you when they realize you're more than just a servant girl with strange dreams." Protect me? The concept was so foreign Lyra almost couldn't process it. "Why would you protect me?" Thane looked at her with an expression so intense it made her knees weak. "Because you're my mate," he said simply. "And even if I can never claim you, even if duty demands that I marry someone else, I will not let anyone hurt what belongs to me." The possessive growl in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it sent heat spiralling through her body and made her broken wolf sing with recognition. For the first time in her life, someone was claiming her. Someone was saying she belonged, even if it could never be more than words in a private study where no one else would ever hear them. The servant quarters were little more than a collection of cramped cells carved into the foundation of the pack compound, places where the invisible people lived their invisible lives away from the eyes of those who mattered. Lyra had always found comfort in the darkness here, in the familiar smell of old stone and the sounds of other forgotten souls trying to sleep despite empty bellies and aching bones. But tonight the darkness felt different, predatory. And when Luna Cassandra emerged from the shadows like a golden spectre of vengeance, Lyra knew that her brief moment of impossible dreams was about to come crashing down around her. "Hello, dear." Cassandra's voice was honey over poison, sweet enough to mask the venom beneath, but not quite sweet enough to hide it completely. She stood in the doorway of Lyra's tiny room like an avenging angel, her perfect features carved from moonlight and malice. "I thought it was time we had a little chat." Lyra pressed herself against the stone wall, every survival instinct she had developed over 18 years of abuse, screaming warnings through her nervous system. Cassandra had never visited the servant quarters before, had barely acknowledged Lyra's existence, except to occasionally order harsher punishments for imagined infractions. For the future Luna to be here in this place could only mean one thing. Someone was about to suffer, and that someone was her. My lady, Lyra whispered, dropping her eyes to the floor in the submissive posture that had become as natural as breathing. How can I serve you? Cassandra laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass in the confined space. Serve me? Oh, my dear little mouse, I think you've done quite enough serving for one day. Tell me, how was your private meeting with our Alpha King? The question hit like a physical blow, and Lyra felt her heart stutter in her chest. There was no way Cassandra could know about the study, about the conversation, about the impossible moment when Thane's touch had set her entire world on fire. That had been private, secret, something that existed only between them. I don't know what you mean, Lyra said, but even to her own ears the words sounded weak and unconvincing. Don't you? Cassandra stepped into the room, and suddenly the small space felt even smaller, filled with the suffocating presence of someone who had never learned that there were limits to what power could take. Strange, because I distinctly remember seeing you escorted to his study this afternoon. I remember watching you disappear behind those heavy doors for over an hour. I remember the way he looked at you when you finally emerged. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut and wound and expose truths that were meant to stay hidden. Lyra tried to make herself smaller against the wall, tried to disappear into the stone itself, but there was nowhere to run in the tiny cell and nowhere to hide from Cassandra's predatory attention. He was questioning me about the beasts, Lyra said, clinging to the one truth she could safely admit. About what happened in the pens. Was he? Cassandra moved closer, and her beauty became something terrible in the confined space, too sharp and too bright and too perfectly constructed to be entirely human. How fascinating, and what did you tell him about your little display of dark magic? It wasn't dark magic, Lyra protested, then immediately regretted speaking at all when she saw the satisfaction flash in Cassandra's eyes. Any response was more engagement than someone in her position should dare. Any defence was proof of guilt in the twisted logic that governed pack politics. No? Cassandra reached out with one perfectly manicured hand and traced a finger along Lyra's cheek with false tenderness. Then what was it, dear? What did you do to those creatures to make them submit to someone like you? The touch made Lyra's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain still. Fighting back would only make things worse, would only provide justification for whatever punishment Cassandra had already decided to deliver. I didn't do anything, she whispered. I don't understand what happened any more than you do. Liar. The word was delivered with a backhand across her face that sent Lyra stumbling sideways into the wall. Stars exploded behind her eyes, and she tasted blood where her teeth cut the inside of her cheek. The blow had been delivered with supernatural strength, enough force to crack bones if Cassandra had wanted to kill rather than simply punish. I know exactly what you are, Cassandra continued, her voice never losing its sweet musical quality, even as violence radiated from her perfect form. I've always known. Did you think your little performance fooled anyone? Did you think we couldn't smell the otherness on you from the moment you arrived? Otherness. The word hit Lyra like another physical blow, carrying implications she didn't fully understand but somehow recognized as truth. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but the denial sounded hollow even to her own ears. Cassandra laughed again, and this time there was genuine amusement in the sound, the cruel pleasure of someone who had been waiting years to reveal a secret that had festered in darkness. Of course you don't, you poor stupid little thing. How could you know when we've worked so hard to keep you ignorant? We. The pronoun carried weight that made Lyra's blood freeze. This wasn't just Cassandra's cruelty. This was something bigger, something organised, something that had been planned and executed with deliberate precision over the course of years. You were found during a raid, Cassandra continued, beginning to pace in the small space like a predator, savouring the moment before the killing blow. A baby, barely old enough to shift, discovered in the ruins of a pack that had been completely annihilated. The official story was that you were probably the child of some minor pack member, an orphan to be raised out of charity and Christian kindness. Each word felt like another piece of a puzzle Lyra hadn't even known she was supposed to solve. She stared at Cassandra and felt the foundations of everything she thought she knew about herself beginning to crack and shift. "But I knew better," Cassandra said, and her eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "I could smell it on you even then, that ancient bloodline that should have died out centuries ago. So I made sure you were properly managed." "Managed how?" The question slipped out before Lyra could stop it, driven by a desperate need to understand what had been done to her, and why. Cassandra's smile was a thing of terrible beauty. "The herbs in your food, dear. The special tea I had the kitchen staff serve you every morning without fail. The little additions to your meals that no one else ever received. Did you never wonder why you were always so weak, why your wolf never fully developed, why you could barely shift even on the full moon?" The words hit Lyra like a landslide, burying everything she thought she knew about herself under an avalanche of horrible understanding. The constant fatigue that had plagued her since childhood, the way her wolf had always felt broken and incomplete, the strange weakness that made her slower and smaller and less than every other pack member. It hadn't been natural. It had been deliberate. "Suppression herbs," Cassandra continued with obvious pleasure in Lyra's shock. "Carefully measured doses designed to block your abilities without killing you outright. 18 years of slow, careful poisoning to make sure you never discovered what you really are." "What am I?" The question came out as barely more than a breath, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of confusion and self-doubt and desperate need to understand. Cassandra leaned in close, so close that Lyra could see the golden flecks in her eyes and smell the expensive perfume that couldn't quite mask something else underneath, something that smelled like fear and desperation and the bitter tang of secrets too long kept. "You, my dear little mouse," Cassandra whispered, "are the last heir of the Silverbrook pack, the final descendant of the Beastmasters who once commanded every wild creature in the known world. Your parents were the most powerful supernatural leaders in a generation, and they died because people like me made sure they died." The revelation hit Lyra like a physical force, sending her stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the stone wall. Beastmasters, ancient bloodlines, parents who were powerful leaders rather than nameless casualties. Everything she had ever believed about herself was a lie, and everything she had been told about her worthlessness was a deliberate construction designed to keep her from discovering the truth. "Why?" she whispered, and the word came out broken and raw. "Why tell me this now?" Cassandra's expression shifted, and for the first time genuine emotion flickered beneath the perfect mask. Fear, desperation, the realization that carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. "Because those suppression herbs are finally wearing off," she said, and her voice carried an edge of panic that she couldn't quite control. "Because what happened with those beasts today was just the beginning. Because if you continue to awaken, if you discover the full extent of what you can do, everything I've worked for will be destroyed." As if summoned by her words, Lyra felt something stir in the depths of her consciousness. The ancient presence that had begun to wake in the beast pens pushed against the barriers that had contained it for so long, and this time those barriers felt thinner, more fragile, like glass that had been struck one too many times. Her eyes flashed silver for just an instant, and her fingernails extended into claws that scraped against the stone wall behind her. The partial shift lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make Cassandra take a step backward, with genuine fear flickering across her perfect features. "There it is," Cassandra breathed, and her voice was equal parts triumph and terror. "There's the monster I've been keeping caged!" Lyra stared down at her hands, where normal human nails had returned, but she could still feel the power thrumming beneath her skin like electricity looking for a way out. For the first time in her life she felt dangerous. For the first time in her life she felt like something other than prey. and in the deepest part of her mind, a voice that was definitely not her broken wolf whispered words that changed everything. "Soon, child, very soon they will all know what we truly are." The ancient archives beneath the Pack compound were a labyrinth of stone corridors and forgotten chambers where the weight of centuries pressed down like a physical force. Alpha King Thane moved through the dusty passages with a torch in one hand and desperation driving his every step, searching for answers that might explain the impossible girl who had turned his carefully ordered world upside down. The records were kept in massive leather-bound volumes that chronicled Pack history going back 15 generations. Treaties and territorial disputes, bloodline genealogies and battle accounts, all of it meticulously documented by scribes who understood that memory could be corrupted, but written words endured. Thane had spent hours down here as a young heir, learning the stories that shaped their world, but tonight he searched for something specific. Something about a massacre that had happened 18 years ago and the mysterious baby girl who had been found in its aftermath. The Silverbrook Pack incident was buried deep in the archives, filed under territorial raids, rather than the more significant political events that merited prominent placement. Thane almost missed it entirely, scanning past the entry twice before the dates finally registered in his tired mind. He pulled the volume from its shelf with trembling hands and opened it to pages that smelled of old parchment and secrets. The official account was brief, clinical in the way that historical records always were when describing events too terrible for emotional language. Silverbrook Pack compound discovered destroyed following territorial dispute, no survivors identified, single infant recovered from ruins, origins unknown, accepted into Moonhaven under charity provisions. But it was the marginalia that made Thane's blood freeze. Notes written in his father's distinctive handwriting, observations that had never made it into the official record. Child exhibits unusual characteristics, bloodline unknown but potentially significant. Recommend careful monitoring and suppression protocols until nature can be determined. Suppression protocols. The words carried implications that made Thane's wolf pace with agitated recognition. His father had known there was something different about Lyra from the beginning, something that required active measures to contain rather than simple neglect. Thane flipped through more pages, following the scattered references to Silverbrook Pack that appeared throughout the historical accounts. What he found painted a picture that made his hands shake as he read. Silverbrook had not been just another territorial rival. They had been the last holdout of an ancient bloodline, beastmasters whose abilities had once been legend throughout the supernatural world. The beastmasters had been extinct for over 2 centuries, their bloodlines diluted through intermarriage or eliminated entirely through systematic persecution. They had commanded the loyalty of wild creatures, could speak mentally with everything from forest wolves to mountain eagles, and their presence had made ordinary Pack territories into supernatural sanctuaries where the ancient magic still flowed strong. According to the records, Silverbrook had been the final bastion of that dying breed, holding on to traditions and abilities that the modern supernatural world had deemed too dangerous to survive. Their leaders had been Marcus and Elena Silverbrook, described in hushed terms as possessing power levels that bordered on the mythical. And they had died the same night that a baby girl was found crying in the ruins of their compound. Thane closed his eyes and felt pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place with terrible clarity. Lyra wasn't just some random orphan who happened to exhibit strange abilities. She was the daughter of the most powerful beastmasters in living memory, the heir to bloodlines that had been deliberately extinguished to prevent exactly what was happening now. She was awakening, and when she fully came into her power, every supernatural creature within 1,000 miles would recognize her as their rightful queen. Meanwhile, in the darkness above ground, Lyra made her way through the Pack compound with steps that felt lighter and more confident than they had in years. The conversation with Cassandra had shattered something inside her, but it had also freed something else. The constant weight of confusion and self-doubt was lifting, replaced by a clarity that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She should have been afraid, should have been devastated by the revelation that 18 years of her life had been built on lies and deliberate poisoning. Instead, she felt angry, not the helpless internalized rage of someone who had no choice but to accept abuse, but the clean, focused fury of someone who finally understood that she had been wronged and possessed the power to do something about it. The beast pens called to her like a magnetic pull she could no longer ignore. The creatures there had recognized something in her that she was only beginning to understand herself, and she needed to test the limits of whatever was awakening inside her consciousness. The dire wolf was waiting for her when she slipped through the gates, its massive form materializing from the shadows like it had been expecting her arrival. Up close, in the moonlight, she could see that its silver coat was marked with patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, and its golden eyes held intelligence that was definitely not animal. "Hello," she said softly, feeling slightly foolish for speaking aloud to a creature that couldn't possibly understand human language. The dire wolf cocked its massive head and replied directly into her mind with a voice like distant thunder. "Hello, little queen. We have been waiting for you to come back to us." The mental communication hit her with the force of recognition rather than surprise. Of course they could speak to her. Of course she could understand them. The abilities that had been suppressed for so long were finally breaking free, and what had seemed impossible this morning now felt as natural as breathing. "You know what I am," she said, and it wasn't a question. "We have always known," the dire wolf replied, rising to its feet and padding closer until its massive head was level with her chest. "Your scent carries the old bloodlines, the ancient treaties between our kinds. You are Beastmaster, daughter of Beastmasters, heir to the compact that binds wild to royal." Around them, other creatures began emerging from the shadows. The shadow cat with violet eyes, the stone bear with crystal claws, the storm eagles whose feathers crackled with electricity. All of them approached with the reverent care of subjects coming before their rightful ruler, and all of them radiated welcome that felt like coming home after a lifetime in exile. "Can you teach me?" Lyra asked, reaching out tentatively to touch the dire wolf's silver coat. The fur was softer than it looked, warm with life and power that seemed to flow between them at the point of contact. "I don't know how to control this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "The knowledge is already within you," the dire wolf said, pressing its great head against her palm with gentle pressure. "Your bloodline carries the memories of 100 generations of beastmasters. You need only remember what was never truly forgotten." Lyra closed her eyes and tried to reach for whatever the dire wolf was describing. Deep in her consciousness, beneath the layers of suppression and self-doubt, she found something that pulsed with ancient authority. Not her broken wolf, but something far older and more powerful, something that remembered what it meant to run through sacred forests with packs of loyal creatures, to speak the languages that predated human speech, to serve as bridge between the civilized world and the wild places where magic still flowed free. When she opened her eyes again, every creature in the beast pens was arranged in a perfect circle around her, all of them resting in poses of absolute submission. But more than that, she could feel them in her mind, like extensions of her own consciousness. Their hearts beat in rhythm with hers, their loyalty flowed through her veins like liquid gold, and their combined strength made her feel more powerful than she had ever imagined possible. Across the compound, Elder Moira watched from the shadows with satisfaction and relief. She had suspected the truth about the girl for years, had seen the signs that others chose to ignore or explain away. The suppression herbs had been cleverly administered, carefully measured to block abilities without destroying them entirely. But Moira had been waiting for this moment since Lyra was old enough to walk. The old bloodlines were awakening. The ancient compact between human and beast was stirring back to life. And despite Cassandra's best efforts to prevent it, the Beastmaster heir was finally discovering who she was meant to be. In the archives below, Thane found the final piece of evidence he needed, a genealogy chart that traced the Silverbrook bloodline back 12 generations, showing connections to royal houses and ancient treaties that predated the current pact system by centuries. At the bottom of the chart, in his father's careful handwriting, was a single name. Lyra Silverbrook, last heir, status, contained. Not protected or sheltered or hidden for her own safety, contained like a dangerous weapon that might explode if not properly managed. Thane stared at the word and felt his wolf rage against the implications. They had not saved her. They had imprisoned her in plain sight, stolen her birthright and poisoned her heritage, and convinced her she was nothing when she was actually everything. And now she was awakening, despite all their careful precautions. The most powerful supernatural bloodline in recorded history was stirring back to life, and the girl he had dismissed as a servant was about to become the most dangerous person in their world. The girl who was also his mate, whether the moon goddess had a sense of humour or simply understood that some bonds were too profound for politics to break. The attack came in the deepest part of the night, when shadows moved with purpose and the darkness itself seemed to have teeth. Lyra woke to the sound of her door splintering inward, wood exploding in a shower of splinters that cut through the air like thrown knives. 3 figures in black moved through the opening with the fluid grace of trained killers, their faces hidden behind masks that turned them into faceless harbingers of death. She rolled out of her narrow bed just as the first assassin's blade sliced through the space where her throat had been seconds before, the metal singing against stone as it carved a groove in the wall. Terror flooded her system with ice-water clarity, every survival instinct she had developed over 18 years of abuse screaming at her to run, to hide, to become invisible before they could finish what they had come to do. But there was nowhere to run in the tiny servant's cell, and invisibility would not save her from blades that had already found their target. The second assassin moved to block the doorway while the third circled left, their coordination speaking of careful planning and professional execution. They had come to kill, not capture, and they intended to finish their work before anyone could interfere. The first assassin lunged again, his blade aimed at her heart with surgical precision. Lyra threw herself sideways, feeling the wind from the strike ruffle her hair as death passed inches from her face. She hit the stone floor hard, scraping skin from her palms and knees, but managed to roll behind the small wooden table that served as her only furniture. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her throat by pure instinct. "I don't know what you want. I don't have anything worth stealing." The assassin said nothing, moving with the silent efficiency of professionals who understood that conversation was a luxury they could not afford. The one blocking the door gestured sharply, and his companions began their final approach from both sides, herding her into the corner where killing would be easier. That was when the ancient presence in her mind exploded into wakefulness with the force of a lightning strike. The terror that had been flooding her system suddenly transformed into something else entirely, something that burned through her veins like liquid fire and made her vision sharpen until she could see every detail of her attacker's movements with crystal clarity. Power surged through her consciousness, not the broken whisper of her suppressed wolf, but something vast and primal and utterly furious at the threat to its chosen vessel. Without conscious thought, Lyra opened her mind and screamed. It was not a sound that came from her throat, but a psychic call that exploded outward through the compound with the force of a supernatural shockwave. Every creature within miles felt the desperate summons of their awakening queen, and every single one of them responded with immediate, violent loyalty. The dire wolf was the first to arrive, smashing through the stone wall of her cell like it was made of paper rather than centuries-old masonry. Rock exploded inward in a cascade of debris as the massive creature burst into the tiny room, its golden eyes blazing with protective fury and its fangs bared in a snarl that made the very air vibrate with menace. The assassins stumbled backward in shock, their careful plan shattered by the appearance of a creature that should have been safely contained in the beast pens. The one nearest to Lyra raised his blade to strike at the dire wolf, but never completed the motion. The shadow cat materialized from the darkness behind him like living nightmare, its claws raking across his throat in a spray of crimson that painted the walls with the price of threatening their queen. More creatures poured through the destroyed wall in a flood of fur and fangs and ancient loyalty. The stone bear's roar shook dust from the ceiling as it caught the second assassin and lifted him off his feet with claws that punched through armor like it was silk. Storm eagles dove through the opening with electricity crackling along their wingspans, their talons finding the pressure points that would paralyze without killing immediately. The third assassin, the one who had blocked the doorway, tried to flee. He made it 3 steps before the frost serpents caught him, their icy coils wrapping around his legs and bringing him down in a tangle of limbs and hissing scales that left him trapped and helpless, but still breathing. In the space of 30 seconds, 3 professional killers had been reduced to corpses and captives by creatures that had answered their queen's call for protection with a speed and violence that defied every law of nature and pack politics. Lyra stood in the centre of the chaos, power still coursing through her veins like electricity, and felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness. The ancient presence was fully awake now, no longer stirring or testing the boundaries of its prison, but standing at full attention with authority that made the air around her shimmer with barely visible energy. She could feel every creature in the compound through the psychic connection that linked them to her bloodline. Their hearts beat in rhythm with hers, their loyalty flowed through her awareness like a river of liquid gold, and their combined strength made her feel like she could command armies if she chose to do so. Silver light began to emanate from her skin, not quite visible in normal sight, but definitely present in the supernatural spectrum that governed the world of creatures and power. Her eyes blazed with metallic fire, and when she moved, the air around her rippled like heat waves rising from sun-warmed stone. That was how Alpha King Thane found her when he arrived with his personal guard, drawn by the sounds of destruction and the psychic shockwave that had awakened every supernatural sense in the compound. He stood in the doorway of what had once been her cell and stared at a scene that redefined everything he thought he knew about power and control and the girl who had been dismissed as worthless. Lyra stood surrounded by the most dangerous predators in their territory, every single creature arranged in a protective circle around her, with their attention focused outward toward potential threats. Silver light played across her skin like captured starlight, and her eyes held depths of authority that made his wolf whimper with recognition and submission. She was not the invisible servant girl anymore. She was not the broken thing that had been poisoned and suppressed and convinced she was nothing. This was the Beastmaster heir in the first stages of her true awakening, terrible and beautiful and powerful enough to reshape the supernatural world if she chose to exercise the full extent of her abilities. "Lyra," he said carefully, aware that sudden movements or aggressive tones might provoke a response from creatures that were clearly operating on protective instincts rather than rational thought. "Are you hurt?" She turned to look at him, and the weight of her attention made him feel like he was being evaluated by something far older and more dangerous than the girl he had questioned in his study. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that had not been there before, echoes of authority that seemed to resonate in his bones. "They came to kill me," she said, and the simple statement carried implications that made his blood freeze. 3 assassins, professional killers sent by someone who wants me dead. Thane looked at the bodies scattered around the destroyed room, at the survivor who was wrapped in frost serpent coils and still breathing despite the terror glazing his eyes. "Who sent them?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lyra's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and in it he saw not the gentle servant girl, but the heir to bloodlines that had once commanded the loyalty of every wild creature in existence. "I think," she said with deadly certainty, "it's time we ask Cassandra some very direct questions about her recent activities." The dire wolf lifted its massive head and howled, a sound that carried triumph and warning and the promise of justice finally delivered. Around the compound, every creature that had answered their queen's call echoed the sentiment, creating a symphony of supernatural voices that announced to the world that the Beastmaster bloodline was awake, aware, and no longer willing to be contained. And in the ruins of her former prison, Lyra stood with silver light dancing across her skin and felt the last chains of suppression finally shatter completely. She was no longer the girl who had learned to make herself invisible. She was the heir to power that could reshape nations, and she was done pretending to be anything less than what the moon goddess had made her. The Alpha King's private chambers had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary, the luxurious space filled with the scent of healing herbs, and the tension that came from too many secrets finally dragged into the light. Lyra sat on the edge of Thane's massive bed, her servant's dress torn and blood-stained, while the pack physician examined the cuts on her arms, with hands that trembled slightly whenever the silver light still flickering beneath her skin grew brighter. The beasts had been convinced to return to the compound's grounds, though they remained restless and protective, their mental voices a constant background hum in Lyra's consciousness. She could feel them pacing outside the windows, ready to tear through walls again if anyone threatened their awakening queen. The connection was no longer something she could suppress or ignore. It was part of her now, as natural as breathing and twice as necessary. "The wounds are superficial, Doctor," Hendricks reported to Thane, though his eyes never quite met either of theirs directly. "Cuts and bruises, nothing that won't heal within days, but her blood—" He hesitated, looking like a man who had discovered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about medicine and supernatural physiology. "What about her blood?" Thane's voice carried the edge of an Alpha King who was rapidly running out of patience for evasion and half-truths. "There are traces of suppression compounds," the physician said carefully. "Concentrated doses of herbs that are typically used to block supernatural abilities in dangerous prisoners. But the concentrations suggest long-term administration over years rather than recent dosing." The confirmation of what they had already suspected hit the room like a physical blow. Thane's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Lyra felt his rage through the mate bond that continued to pulse between them like a living thing. Someone had been systematically poisoning her since childhood, stealing her birthright one carefully measured dose at a time. "How long?" Thane asked, and the quiet menace in his voice made even Dr. Hendricks take a step backward. "Based on the accumulated traces, I would estimate 15 to 18 years of consistent exposure," the physician replied. "Someone has been very deliberately suppressing her abilities for most of her life." When the door closed behind the departing doctor, Lyra and Thane were finally alone, with the weight of everything that had been revealed and everything that still lay between them, like an unbridgeable chasm. She could feel his eyes on her, studying the way silver light continued to play beneath her skin, the way her posture held confidence that had never been there before. "You're different," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm awake," Lyra replied, testing the truth of the words as she spoke them. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm actually awake instead of sleepwalking through someone else's nightmare." Thane moved to the window, staring out at the shapes of loyal creatures that prowled his grounds with protective intent. "Those beasts," he said. "They answered your call faster than trained warhounds respond to their handlers. They broke through stone walls to reach you." "They recognize what I am," Lyra said, and there was wonder in her voice as she spoke the words aloud. "What I've always been, even when I didn't know it myself. The bloodline calls to them, and they answer because that's what their ancestors have done for 1,000 years." Beastmaster, Thane said, and the title carried weight that made the air between them shimmer with possibility and danger. Last heir of Silverbrook, daughter of the most powerful supernatural leaders in living memory. Lyra stood and walked to where he waited by the window, drawn by the mate bond that sang between them with increasing intensity now that her abilities were no longer suppressed. When she stopped beside him, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin and smell the scent that had haunted her dreams for weeks without her understanding why. "And your mate," she added quietly. "Don't forget that part." Thane turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes was complex enough to break hearts. Longing and desperation, and the terrible knowledge that wanting something was not the same as being able to claim it. "That's the part that's going to destroy everything," he said. "You know that, don't you?" "Because of the political marriage," Lyra said, and there was pain in her voice, but also a steadiness that spoke of someone who had finally stopped running from difficult truths. "Because choosing me over Cassandra will break the alliance and leave the pack vulnerable to attack." "The Eastern Territories have been massing forces for months," Thane said, his voice carrying the weight of a leader who understood the costs of every decision. "Without Cassandra's pack as allies, we'll be outnumbered 3-1 if they decide to invade. People will die, Lyra, thousands of them." "And if you choose duty over the mate bond," Lyra countered, moving closer until she could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes, "you'll spend the rest of your life feeling like half your soul has been torn away. We'll both spend our lives incomplete, knowing exactly what we've lost and why we can never have it back." The truth of her words hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Thane reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her heart stutter in her chest. "I've been trying to convince myself that duty is more important than desire," he admitted, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones with reverent care. "That a good king sacrifices his personal happiness for the greater good of his people." "And?" Lyra leaned into his touch, feeling the mate bond flare to brilliant life where their skin connected. "And I'm starting to think that's the coward's way of avoiding a choice I'm afraid to make," Thane said, his voice rough with emotions he could no longer suppress. "Maybe a truly good king finds a way to protect his people without destroying his own soul in the process." The admission hung between them like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. Lyra felt tears she hadn't expected sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing someone acknowledge that she was worth fighting for. "The research I found in the archives," Thane continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Your parents weren't just powerful beastmasters, they were leaders who united dozens of packs under their protection, who created alliances based on mutual strength rather than political convenience. What if the answer isn't choosing between you and duty? What if the answer is understanding that you are the duty I should have been preparing for all along?" Hope flared in Lyra's chest, bright and dangerous and utterly terrifying. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the heir to the most powerful supernatural bloodline in history doesn't need to hide behind political marriages and territorial compromises," Thane said, leaning closer until his forehead rested against hers. "I'm saying that maybe the Eastern Territories won't be so eager to attack a pack that's allied with someone who can command the loyalty of every wild creature from here to the ocean." The possibility he was suggesting was so enormous that Lyra felt dizzy trying to process it, not hiding her abilities or pretending to be less than what she was, but embracing her heritage fully and using it to protect rather than simply survive. "The mate bond," she whispered, hardly daring to voice the hope that was building in her chest. "Is the moon goddess telling us that some connections are too important to sacrifice for politics?" Thane finished. "That some bonds are meant to reshape the world rather than be reshaped by it?" When he kissed her, it was with the desperate hunger of someone who had been denying himself water in a desert and finally found a spring. The mate bond exploded between them with golden light that made the very air around them sing, and Lyra felt every barrier she had built around her heart crumble into dust. This was what she had been missing her entire life. Not just acceptance or protection or even love, but recognition. The acknowledgement that she was valuable, not despite her differences but because of them. That her power was meant to be claimed rather than hidden. That her worth had never been in question, except by people who had their own reasons for keeping her small. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the silver light beneath Lyra's skin had brightened until it was clearly visible, and Thane's eyes held depths of determination that spoke of decisions finally made. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Now, we stop pretending that political convenience is more important than supernatural truth," Thane said, and his voice carried the authority of an alpha king who had finally remembered that true leadership meant protecting what mattered rather than sacrificing it. "Now we figure out how to turn a Beastmaster heir into a queen who can protect her people instead of hiding from them." "And Cassandra?" Thane's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "Now, we have some very direct questions to ask about assassination attempts and 18 years of systematic poisoning. And I suspect that once we get our answers, the political landscape is going to change rather dramatically." Outside the windows, the loyal creatures that had answered their queen's call lifted their voices in a harmony that spoke of ancient compacts finally honoured and bloodlines finally free to claim their destiny. The sound carried across the compound like a promise and a warning, announcing to anyone who cared to listen that the age of hiding was over. The Beastmaster heir had awakened, and the world was about to discover what that meant for everyone who had spent years pretending she didn't matter. The sacred grove lay at the heart of the ancient forest, where trees older than memory stretched their branches toward a canopy so thick that daylight filtered through in cathedral beams of gold and green. This was where the first Beastmasters had communed with the wild spirits, where bloodlines had been awakened and compacts forged between human and creature that transcended ordinary understanding of power and loyalty. Elder Moira moved through the grove with the careful reverence of someone who understood that they walked on holy ground, her weathered hands carrying supplies that had been hidden away for 18 years, waiting for this moment. Ceremonial herbs that would burn with silver smoke, crystals carved from stones that had drunk moonlight for centuries, and most importantly, the ancient blade that had belonged to Lyra's mother, still sharp enough to cut through the veils between worlds. "Are you certain about this?" Moira asked, as Lyra approached the circle of standing stones at the grove's centre, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that some transformations could not be undone. "The awakening ritual is not simply about accessing your abilities. It will change who you are at the most fundamental level. The girl who enters this circle will not be the same person who emerges." Lyra paused at the edge of the sacred space, feeling power thrumming beneath her feet like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The suppression that had caged her for 18 years was already cracking, fragments of her true nature bleeding through in moments of crisis and connection. But what Moira was offering was complete liberation. No more barriers, no more pretending, no more half measures and careful control. "I'm tired of being afraid of what I might become," Lyra said, stepping across the threshold into the circle where her ancestors had claimed their inheritance for 100 generations. "I want to know who I really am when no one is trying to keep me small." The standing stones responded to her presence immediately, ancient runes carved into their surfaces beginning to glow with silver fire that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight. The very air grew thick with expectation, charged with the kind of power that made reality seem thin and malleable around the edges. Moira began the ritual preparations, with movements that spoke of muscle memory preserved across decades of waiting. She scattered the ceremonial herbs in patterns that had been old when the first packs claimed territory, lit candles that burned with flames too bright and too steady to be entirely natural, and placed the crystal formations at precise points around the circle where they hummed with resonant energy. "Your parents stood in this very spot the night they claimed their full inheritance," Moira said as she worked, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting sacred history. Elena was 19, Marcus barely 21, and they were terrified of what they might become, but they understood that fear was a luxury their people could not afford. "Tell me about them," Lyra said, settling into the centre of the circle where the stone floor was worn smooth by centuries of ceremonies. "I need to know who they really were before I try to become what they made me." Moira's eyes grew distant with memory and loss. "Your mother could speak to storm eagles in their own language, could call down lightning with a gesture and command the loyalty of creatures that had never bent their will to any human authority. Your father was different, quieter in his power, but when he walked through the forest, every living thing from the smallest mouse to the greatest bear understood that their king had come home." The images painted by her words made Lyra's chest ache with longing for parents she had never known, but whose legacy ran in her veins like liquid fire. "How did they die?" "Fighting to protect what mattered," Moira said simply. When the old ways were declared dangerous and the ancient bloodlines were marked for elimination, they chose to stand and fight rather than hide or flee. They died believing that someday their daughter would finish what they started. The weight of inherited responsibility settled on Lyra's shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. This was not just about claiming her personal power. This was about fulfilling a destiny that had been written in bloodlines older than written history, about becoming the bridge between worlds that her parents had died trying to protect. "I'm ready," she said, and the words echoed through the grove with authority that made the stones themselves ring like struck bells. Moira lifted the ceremonial blade, its surface reflecting silver fire from the glowing runes, and offered it to Lyra with both hands. "Then let the awakening begin." The moment Lyra's fingers closed around the blade's hilt, the world exploded into sensation that redefined everything she thought she knew about pain and power and the boundaries of human experience. Energy poured through the weapon like liquid lightning, racing up her arms and into her core where it collided with the suppressed heritage that had been caged for so long. The barriers that had contained her true nature for 18 years didn't crack or bend. They shattered completely, all at once, with a violence that sent shockwaves through her entire being. Power flooded through her consciousness like water breaking through a dam, carrying with it memories and abilities and connections that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what she was losing. She could feel them all suddenly, every wild creature within 100 miles, their heartbeats synchronizing with hers as ancient compacts reasserted themselves with the force of natural law. Dire wolves and shadow cats and stone bears, storm eagles and frost serpents and moon panthers, all of them turning toward the sacred grove where their queen was finally claiming what had always been hers by right. But the mental expansion was only the beginning. Her body began to change as well, bones cracking and reforming as her human shell proved too small to contain the magnitude of what she was becoming. Her spine elongated, her limbs stretched, her senses exploded into spectrums of perception that made the ordinary world seem flat and colourless by comparison. Pain lanced through every nerve as her wolf fought its way to the surface, not the broken creature that had been suppressed for so long, but something magnificent and terrible that had been waiting its entire existence for this moment of liberation. She heard herself scream, but the sound came out as a howl that made the very earth tremble beneath the sacred stones. Silver light erupted from her skin, so bright that the grove was transformed into something that existed between the mortal world and the realm of pure magic. Her human form dissolved and reformed, dissolved and reformed, caught between shapes as her true nature struggled to express itself through flesh that had never been allowed to hold such power. When the transformation finally stabilized, Lyra stood in the center of the circle, no longer entirely human, but not quite wolf either. Something between and beyond both, touched by starlight and shadow in equal measure. Her hair had turned silver white, her eyes blazed with metallic fire, and when she moved, the air around her rippled with barely contained energy that spoke of forces that could reshape mountains if she chose to direct them. She could feel everything now, every heartbeat in the forest, every breath taken by creatures both wild and tame, every drop of water flowing through underground streams, and every whisper of wind through ancient branches. The sacred grove had become the centre of a web that connected her to all living things within her territory, and through that web she could command or protect or nurture as her will demanded. But more than that, she could feel her parents' presence in the stones beneath her feet, in the silver fire that danced along the ancient runes, in the very air that carried the scent of magic and power and promises finally kept. They had died to preserve this moment, had sacrificed everything so that their daughter could stand where she stood now and claim what had always been hers by birthright and blood. "I am Lyra Silverbrook," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the stones sing in response. "Daughter of Elena and Marcus, heir to the ancient compact, queen of all wild things that run beneath moon and star." The grove erupted with the sound of creatures answering their queen's declaration, howls and roars and cries that spoke of loyalty freely given and bonds that could not be broken by politics or fear or the small-minded cruelty of those who valued control over truth. And in the distance, carried on wind that tasted of storm and starlight, came an answering call from the Alpha King, who felt the awakening through the mate bond that connected their souls. Thane's howl was acknowledgement and acceptance, and the promise that he would stand beside her no matter what forces rose against them. The Beastmaster bloodline was fully awake at last, and the world would never be the same.